thank you all for coming. I want to mention in particular that Ted Lempert's class on California politics is here, so thank you very much to Ted for bringing the class, and thank you to the students who actually came. Sometimes when classes are moved, not everyone shows up, so you get extra. They should get some, yeah. There should be some extra credit or something. So thank you for being here. I also want to mention this is co-sponsored by the Berkeley Political Review and by Pi Sigma Alpha, the Political Science Honor Society. So thank you to those student groups. And after this is over, we hope you can join us for a reception, which is right through those doors. We've got some food and drinks in there and so forth, so come in and stick around and have a bite to eat. I should also mention for the students who are here, we hope you can join us for the reception. You should note that the room where we're having the reception is the Robert Matsui Group Study Room, which we just built. It is reservable by groups of undergraduates for group study. So Dead Week is coming up, finals are coming up. If you want a nice room to study in, you can go on to our website, which is politics.berkeley.edu, and reserve that room and use it for study. There's a flat screen TV and a whiteboard and all that sort of stuff. I should also mention that there are some flyers in there about our internship program. So for undergraduates who are here, we hope you'll take those and consider applying to one of our internship programs. Okay, so on to California taxes. We're going to ask each speaker to speak for a few minutes, and then after that, I may have a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. I'm going to begin with, I tell you what, I'll just do brief bios now, and then we'll, wow. Okay.
That was the end of Molly Munger.
I'm glad you're not mic'd, Jack. Professor Citron said he's looking forward to the program. Okay, so brief introductions. I'm going to go in the order in which people are going to speak. First up is going to be on my far left, on your far right, Dave Dorr. Dave is the Chief Tax Consultant for the California Taxpayers Association. He has a long history with California tax policy and tax law. He first went to work for the State Assembly in 1959. He later served as chief consultant to both the Assembly Government Organization Committee, and then for 23 years, he was chief consultant to the Assembly Revenue and Tax Committee, Revenue and Taxation Committee, I guess it is. Rev and Tax is what it's always called in Sacramento. In 1987, he became the chief tax consultant for CalTax. He's the founding editor of the association's newsletter, CalTax Newsletter, where he's written about many topics of tax policy. He's also the author of California's Tax Machine, A History of Taxing and Spending in the Golden State. I meant to bring a copy and I forgot it. Dave, hold up your book there, yeah. It's available on Amazon, and I think that he also is going to mention something about that book in a moment. It is the Bible of tax history for California. And I also learned today, I didn't know this, that he was on the San Juan Unified School Board at one time, so he actually has a history in elective politics from 1976 to 1981. He voted against granting authority for the district to sue the state to overturn Prop 13, and as a result, he was the only member of the board who was not recalled. So he survived. After that, we're going to have sort of a joint presentation by John Ellwood, who is closest to me, and then John Decker. Raise your hand, John. John Ellwood is a professor of public policy here at Cal at the Goldman School, where he teaches public budgeting, which he actually co-teaches with John Decker. Also focuses on congressional budget process, legislative behavior, corporate governance, and other issues. John previously served as a staff member for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee and was a member of the original management team at the Congressional Budget Office, where he was a special assistant to the first director of CBO, Alice Rivlin, a well-known figure. He has served as a consultant with a variety of federal and state agencies. From 1995 to 1997, he was the research director at the Public Policy Institute of California. There are many publications, perhaps most relevant for today's discussion, has Proposition 13 delivered, the changing tax burden in California. After that, John Decker will speak. John is also one of the state's leading experts on state and local finances. He's currently the chief fiscal advisor to California Controller John Chung. He previously served in a similar role for California Treasurer Bill Lockyer, and before that was executive director of the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission. Prior to that, he served as the lead budget staffer for the Senate Republican leader and 2 Democratic Assembly speakers. John is a longtime denizen of the Capitol. He teaches, as I said, public budgeting here at the Goldman School. He's a visiting scholar here at IGS. The Rockefeller Foundation awarded him a research fellowship in Bellagio, Italy, which sounds like a junket to me. And he's the author of California in the Balance, Why Budgets Matter, which we published here at IGS. That's also available on Amazon, and we will make some money if you buy a copy, so please do. And last will be Tim Gage, who's in the middle there. Tim is the co-founder and principal at Blue Sky Consulting Group, a public policy and economics consulting firm. Before founding Blue Sky, he was the director of the California Department of Finance under Gray Davis, a post in which he oversaw the development of the state's $100 billion budget, its progress through the legislature, and in which he directed the administration's representation on 70 state boards and commissions. Prior to becoming director of finance, he, like John, was a fiscal staff member in the legislature. Tim served as chief fiscal advisor to 2 presidents pro tem of the state Senate. Before that, he was the chief consultant to the Assembly Ways and Means Committee, and he also served in the Legislative Analyst's Office. After serving as director of finance, he was appointed by both Governors Davis and Schwarzenegger to the Board of Governors for the California Independent System Operator, which runs the state's electrical grid. He currently teaches in the public policy program at USC, and he's an alum of the Goldman School here at Cal. So lots of expertise, needless to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Dorr.
Thanks very much. I think we could start with an infomercial, if you don't mind. Today only, I've been authorized to make what is really an astounding offer. You've been told about the book. If any of you want to leave me your name and address, we will send you a copy free. So you can't beat that. Back to the matters at hand. Call Me Madam, which was a 1950 Irving Berlin musical, which is now rarely performed, was, I think, perhaps the most perceptive on fiscal policy of any of the musicals that have been of note. In short, the U.S. ambassador to Liechtenstein, named Sally Adams, went over there with the idea that she would create goodwill by bringing a tremendous amount of American money, American aid to the country. And the Prime Minister of Liechtenstein, Cosmo, was aghast. His agenda, the country, he felt, needed badly fiscal reform. And if the Americans brought in all this money, it wouldn't happen because it would dispaper over the need for fiscal reform. Well, fast forward to Sacramento in the last few years, there's the same issue. And I might start by saying, I see there's obviously 2 camps, but unfortunately, people don't recognize that they're subsets of each one. First of all, the camp that is not favoring tax increases. That's really 2 separate camps. First of all, there's the people that don't want to increase taxes for a variety of reasons. They think it's bad for the economy, or they think that people are overtaxed, whatever. The second camp is the Prime Minister Cosmo camp. They're not interested in raising taxes because they feel that it will obviate the need for major fiscal reform. And I think that was one of the problems that was the problem last year that was not recognized. And that, I think, led to the demise of the governor's tax bill, because there's people that would go up on a tax with appropriate fiscal reforms, but they feel, as Cosmo did, that if you just put in the money, there will be no fiscal policy reforms. On the tax side, there's also, I think, 2 camps of those that favor tax increases. The first camp was the one, I think, that was predominant when I was consultant to the Assembly Revenue and Taxation Committee for 24 years. That was a good tax policy camp, where we would consider tax increases, but we would not consider and we did not pass stuff that was not what we considered good tax policy. The other camp is the Jesse James camp, which is just give me the money. I don't give a damn how you get it. And that camp, I think, is more predominant today. And you can see that in various proposals. Quickly to run through some of the mentions, these groups 1 and 4 probably will never get together, but I think that they're shifting alliances. Groups 2, 3, and 4 could grow together, or groups 1, 2, and 3, depending on the type of proposals that are on the table. So right now we're at 2 and 2, but there's room, I think, for those shifts. Quickly through the budget reform, we don't have a lot of time here, but the budget process is terrible. It's worse than that. The budget comes out of committee onto the floor in a bill, along with 10 to 20 budget trailer bills, some of which don't have anything to do with the budget. They're jammed through. Nobody knows what's in them. There's no analysis by any independent party like the legislative analyst. So it's just a process that is totally different than the process that was used for at least the period I was in with the legislature and further on, that you had a budget process where everybody had input and decisions were made in policy committees. Another problem is still the issue of waste. We just saw a couple of weeks ago $500 million. Courts decided they couldn't use a computer after spending $500 million trying to put one together. One of the problems with fiscal policy in California is earmarking. Over half the budget is earmarked in the state constitution, and a lot more is earmarked by statute. And in fact, proposals going up on the ballot earmark even more money in the Constitution. You have one in June, it's going to earmark, and the governor's proposal will earmark substantially more to the in the Constitution. I'm waiting until they earmark more than 100%, and then we'll see where we the issue of employee pensions and benefits needs to be addressed. Right now, the governor's budget says that we are unfunded for $45 million for state pensions and $60 million for health benefits, and there's no obvious solution to that that's been proposed. The governor has some pension reforms that nobody thinks the legislature will adopt. So we have that issue. We have a wall of debt. The governor has called it a wall of debt. And there's two kinds of debt. One is the bonded debt, which is about $79 million issued and another $35 million that's authorized. But he's talking about the budget debt. In other words, all the debt that's been created by all the budget gimmicks that have been made, that money has to be paid back. And that's about $35 billion of budget gimmick debt that's now overhanging the budget. And so that needs to be addressed. There's a problem that is a big problem, but it's not generally recognized, that none of the estimates underlying the tax bills or even the budget are really credible. It's like telling people, we're going to give you this information that's wrong, and you make a decision on it. And the reason it's wrong is that the tax estimates are made using a static revenue model. That means nobody's behavior is going to change. But in fact, taxes change behavior, so you're putting out the wrong information. The amount of revenue that's estimated in the governor's tax proposal is, many believe, quite overstated. The Legislative Analyst Office says it's overstated. And people have said, well, people aren't going to move out of state if you put the tax at 13.2%. Well, they don't have to move out of state. All they have to do is buy U.S. government bonds. That can't be taxed by the state. So that there's various kinds of taxpayer behavior that can influence the estimates. And the state is not doing anything to really score these proposals correctly. We have the Unemployment Insurance Fund. It's insolvent. It used to be, money coming in would pay for the benefits going out. It's now insolvent. We've been borrowing from the federal government. Now the federal government just has put on a penalty of $21 per employee for the failure of the state to pay back the federal borrowing, and the governor in the budget has a surcharge of proposing a surcharge of $473 million just to pay the interest on the federal loan. So we have a serious problem that needs to be addressed there. On the revenue side, which I think is one of the topics that you're most interested in, my view is the state basically has a pretty sound revenue structure. Your income tax is the main tax source, which is appropriate. Then you have a consumption tax and a property tax that both bring in about the same amount of revenue, and all three are quite substantial. So the fundamental building blocks are good. The income tax, I think most people would say that the income tax is probably too volatile because we rely too heavily on the highest bracket group. Now they're at 10.2, they may go to 13.2. And that creates budget instability, which is not good for planning budgets or balancing budgets. Some of the other problems with the revenue structure go to problems that have really developed in the last 20 years, where there have been a lot of what people call tax expenditures for various purposes, and those need to be looked at. The question that some of these proposals really put on the table is, will the money from these proposals obviate the need for fundamental fiscal reform that the state needs? If you just pour money into the system without addressing some of these problems, you're not going to get out of the hole. It just is going to fester. The Munger initiative earmarks all the money for education, so that's not going to pull the budget out of the hole. The governor says it's going to all go to education, but most observers believe that some of it will be siphoned off. And the money that goes to education is not necessarily new money. The legislature has made this point, because the schools now count the money that the state gives them in September in June. So you have a very substantial amount of money going to schools in this fiscal year that the state counts in the following fiscal year. And part of this is to reverse that, which doesn't give it new money to schools to spend. But if the estimates are incorrect and it doesn't raise anywhere near the amount they're talking about, it's not going to be a fix for the budget in general that is going to go anywhere near balancing the budget. And if you go to the well once, it's probably more difficult to go to the well over and over and over again. So these are some of the problems that are inherent and some of the issues that we're trying to work through. And I think if you can have some significant fiscal policy reforms, that will perhaps break the stalemate between the two.
Excellent. Okay. John, do you want to?
I'll try.
We're going to drop down a screen here because John, Elwood, and Decker are going to have PowerPoint.
Okay.
If I don't get attacked.
Now, is it going to come on?
It's coming on, I think.
Slowly but surely? Okay. Okay. I forgot to make the slide of the most important slide about tax policy from that great American philosopher, Russell Long, who used to run around Capitol Hill when I worked there with a ditty. Don't tax him, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree. So I find it very significant, for example, that only 24% of Californians are against raising the tobacco tax. There are 24% of Californians who smoke. Okay? The only major tax out there that Californians love to raise are the individual income tax on very rich people, but not the rich people themselves. So, this little slide, we could not get AUERBACH to be here because he's off making money like any good economist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend most of my time talking about economics, of which I have no ability at all, other than that I've worked with them for 30 years in Washington and then here. And then I'll make some comments about the political economy of raising taxes everywhere, but especially in California. The bottom line is, for everything here, by the way, it takes a simple majority to spend in this state. It takes a supermajority to raise the revenue to cover the spending. Guess what happens if it's harder to raise taxes than it is to spend? You get two things. You get deficits, which we don't call them deficits in this state, we call them shortfalls. And there's a reason for that, which is that you can roll over any shortfall, and it's the first thing to be spent to be appropriated the next fiscal year. So it's not quite the same as a federal deficit. And of course, then what you get is you get what we used to in Washington call smoke and mirrors to make it appear that you really didn't do it. That's what the incentives are there for everybody, and that's what you get. Okay, I'm going to go through this rather quickly. This is published out of here, and there was a whole bunch of articles published in the California Journal. It's a great issue of that journal. You can sort of get this. I'll give you these slides for your students should they want them. Okay, so AUERBACH starts off his summary of tax policy in California saying, why are people upset with California tax policy? One has already been talked about, and that's the size of the base, the lack of base broadening. We rely too much on a small group of taxpayers, and their incomes are unstable, and this contributes to a volatile system. Secondly, the system is distortionary, and therefore it hinders California's ability to attract and encourage economic activity and development, particularly since we hit the people who invest. This is the Mitt Romney point about the whole United States. Finally, overall, my view is this is a question of taste. The level of revenues are just too high in California, all right? And because of that, all good people flee the state, or we have tax takers versus taxpayers, and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to use AUERBACH slides or graphics and some others to just say, are these things true? This is my argument, which I already gave you, which is there's only one true evil out there, and that's supermajorities. I am a Madisonian. I come from the East Coast, even though I've lived here 21 years. Direct democracy is stupid. The founding fathers knew it was stupid, but Californians love it, and Jack can give you tons of data on how stop chasing windmills, because that's the way it is. And we have a requirement for a supermajority to raise the revenues to cover the expenditures. Okay, and that leads to shortfalls, and then smoke and mirrors to make it appear it doesn't happen. And I want to say something nice about Jerry Brown. It's very hard. Much more than recent governors, he's trying to, because he really is a hair shirt governor, he's trying to convince you that you have to pay for what you get. And he's not as bad as previous governors in terms of using smoke and mirrors. And that's not to say he's perfect, but he's not as bad. Okay, is it a high tax state? Yes and no. One of the problems here, there are two problems. One is the data always lags. So the latest good data we have is from 2008. By the way, that's before the Great Recession, or it's the first year of the Great Recession. If you believe in that, California, under some measures, and everybody has their favorite measure, and I use the one that economists use, which is revenues as a percentage of personal income. California comes up 16th, bounces around a lot, but let's say it's 16th. You might say it's 20, whatever. That means California is a medium-high tax state, okay? And two ways of looking at that. One is that there are 15 states with much bigger governments, states, okay, out there. It also means there are 35 states with smaller governments, which means if you don't like California, there's Arizona. Or even better, there's Texas. Or even better, there's Florida. How many of you want to move to those places? See, it's all your fault because you refuse to move to places where you wouldn't have to pay such high taxes. It's called fiscal federalism by economists. It's the great thing is essentially you can, with your little feet, assuming you can find a job in these places, or you already have your pension, and you can go where you want to go. You can go for the type of government you like. Okay. Here is state and local revenues. This is from AUERBACH as a percent of personal income. Down the middle here, the dark black line is the national average. Okay, California is the red line. Boom, boom, boom. Texas is much lower. New York is much higher. Now this only goes to 2008, and strange things have happened since 2008. Well, not because of any. The truth is, and we always like to blame our politicians. Okay. This was an international recession, a very deep one, and probably had little to do, since it's everywhere, with anything that your elected officials did in California. It's a national, if not an international recession, okay? And we always like to blame someone, but it's outside, it's exogenous, it's outside our experience. Okay. But it's also the case, this is ELLWOOD'S view, you might not believe it, conservatives won in California. Conservatives believe government should be smaller, and because essentially you can't raise taxes without a 2/3 vote, and because even though the Republican Party is a rump, it's greater than 1/3. So we have not really relied up to this point on raising revenues to deal with the fall off in revenues, and therefore the general fund has shrunk. It's taken a long time, and it's not been perfect, and I probably agree with you, it's not been done in the most efficient way, but it's never done in the most efficient way. And therefore, this is what you see. This is Decker and his staff produced this. Now, this is only for the general fund. So there is a probability that you could shift the burden to the local sector, or you could shift it to other funds, but basically this is right. Okay, this is general fund revenues per $100 as a percentage of personal income. Okay, we are back, folks, to when Reagan left office and Jerry Brown came in terms of the general fund, revenues for the general fund, okay? Obviously, this is what caused Prop 13 there, you know, and then it came down, and then his boss wanted to go back up there, and they didn't make it, but they tried. Because they were good Democrats, and we've just been going down, okay? And it takes, because of the lag, eventually spending on the general fund is going to come down, and it has come down. The high was what, 108? Is that right? 110, 108? 103, okay, and now they're down to what? Mid-70s someplace? Mid-80s? Okay, but that's a huge reduction, okay? So you're talking about 15–20% reduction in the size of the general fund, not even controlling for inflation, okay, which has not been very high, but not controlling for it. So revenues are way down. In Jeunesse last going away thing that he wrote up for his governor, he admitted finally that it wasn't spending that was causing the problem, it was the fall off in revenues. Okay. Now, how does California compare to other states? Okay. As with all state and local tax structures, the California state and local tax structure is regressive. And we have a very progressive individual income tax, but because of the sales tax and the property tax, this is everywhere. Okay. The overall tax system is regressive. It's always regressive on the state level. So therefore, California is among the most progressive states in terms of its state and local taxes, and you have to combine them together because different things are done at different levels in different states. And what makes us different, and I think I disagree a little bit, compared to the average state, we rely more on the individual and corporate income tax, and ours is very progressive compared to the average state. Okay, there is a micro simulation out there, and this is what I used. This is the 2002 data. It's up to 2008, shows the same pattern. For California, this is essentially where California ranks among the states, with one being the highest. So we're sort of toward in the middle at the bottom, but we're the most progressive, other than Georgia of all strange places, at the top. It's structures of tax things. The effective tax burden, if you're in the bottom 20% by income, is 11.3, and if you're in the top 1%, it's 7.2%. Okay, and the final thing is the percentage points above or below the national average. This is the simulation run that was in 2002 data. The 2008 data has just been released, and it's basically the same. So we have a regressive tax system, but much less so than other states. Okay, as you indicated, we have a very volatile tax system, and here's why. It is because the individual income tax is so volatile. The black line is the United States. New York is up top. And of course, this only goes through 2008, so what you see is the dot-com bubble there. And when times are good, boy, does the individual income tax in California bring in money. And then times go bad and collapses, boom. He had to live with this, so he understands. Also, what's the case, and this was, I guess, a result of Prop 13 and how the legislature and the governor dealt with it, we have sort of a centralized government. And John wants to speak to this. Our locals don't have as much in terms of percentage of state and local taxes. We run everything through Sacramento, or not everything, much more than the average state. Okay. Corporate income taxes, the black line is the national. California is the red. New York is always higher. I mean, you know, James Q. Wilson, who recently died, had a great line, which was Wilson's first and second law of evaluations. Never evaluate any program in Minnesota because it always works. That's the Garrison Keillor line. And never evaluate any program in New York because it never works. Okay, so New York is always an outlier in terms of big government. Here's sales taxes. We sort of track the thing. One difference there, the light line is Texas, which has significantly reduced its sales taxes over time. Okay. And this is property taxes, as you know, although it bopped up in 2008, it's gone down, obviously, since then. Because of Prop 13, we rely much less than the average state on property tax. Now, property tax has a great virtue, which is it's not as volatile as income tax, okay? But it's also much more regressive than our income tax. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Now John's going to take over, right? I got to move.
First, let me thank Jack and Ethan for putting this together. Too often when we talk about state finances, we emphasize the expenditure side and don't really spend enough time talking about tax structure. And this is a wonderful opportunity, the first two panelists showed you, to really focus on what it is that the revenue structure is generating and does it make sense. Even if, and I want to be a little contrary here, suppose that one or both of the tax initiatives pass, returning to those. They are by nature temporary. One's a little bit longer than the other, but they're both of a limited period. They give us a wonderful opportunity to actually ask the question that I'd argue we ought to be asking. It may not be, as Dave suggests, a question of pouring money into the state general fund, but rather to look at the overall tax structure and fiscal structure, not only of the state, but of locals. We are in this centralized system where locals are very dependent on state action, both in terms of dictating expenditure side, but also revenues. In that same article, that the same journal that John talked about for the AUERBACH piece, the lead article is by Kane and Knoll, who make a rather compelling case that the post-13 state-local fiscal relationship creates what they call a soft budget constraint on local spending, where locals don't have to be quite as responsible. They wouldn't want to hear this, but they don't have to be quite as responsible because they know that there's a probability, maybe not 100%, but some probability that the state will bail them out or give them discretionary revenue. So the first point, revenue structure really is the servant of this fiscal structure. If we all had our druthers, we'd have lower taxes. We wouldn't pay taxes just to pay them for the fun of it. We do it to serve to fill a certain structure. We ought to look at even if the oh, sorry.
It'll happen automatically. Here it comes, automatically.
Sorry. So even if we get the one or both of these initiatives passed, it would be awfully nice to take the next little bit before they turn off and try to figure out how should we restructure state and local finances so that we get the incentives right that Dave talked about and address the other structural problems and perhaps make a more stable system, both within the state and local. As an anecdote about why the current system doesn't work very well for the state or for locals. This is a picture of local discretionary revenue the state has made available to cities from right after 13 through about 2007. This includes not only the property tax reallocation that both Tim and Dave worked on right after 13, but all the other smaller programs, including supplemental roll. And you can see for up through about 1990, locals could depend on the state to keep giving this discretionary revenue. And then the property tax shifts from the early Wilson years happened, known as ERAF. And all that, that continuing stream of discretionary revenue went away. In the good years under Tim Gage, we started giving more money back, but then it went away again after the dot-com bubble burst. If this is your partnership with locals, no wonder they don't like us. Putting aside taking the redevelopment money, we're just not a steady partner. And if you want to encourage fiscal discipline, maybe you want to think about fixing this centralization and this dependence on state largesse. If you're going to do this redesign, I'd suggest there would be three things you'd want to look at. You'd want to reduce Sacramento's control, centralization. There's lots of things that need to be addressed there. That means but if you want to increase responsibility at the local level, you got to increase discretion both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. And I think that would align both expenditure policy and revenue policy with the person with the governing board that's making the decision about what programs should be spent.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you a little bit today about tax policy and what it means for the state. I'm happy to go last because I get to touch on some of the different themes that others raised and make a few other points. The state lost an enormous amount of money from the recession. For me, from my perspective as a former director of finance, that's the headline here. The current state treasurer refers to that loss of revenue compared to estimates of revenues prior to the recession as California's fiscal earthquake. And we lost about $30 billion a year on an annual basis in terms of general fund revenues. So that's the headline. And from my perspective, I kind of see the issue of taxes and whether or not we should have tax increases through that prism. As a consequence, from my perspective at least, I believe state government is underfunded by probably about 1% or maybe a little more of total personal income in the state. which would translate into roughly $14–15 billion on an annual basis. I think that's probably modest. Now, in fairness, I haven't done the arithmetic to look at exactly what John did with respect to the fiscal relationship between the state and cities across cities, counties, special districts, and schools. Because what you'd want to do is you'd want to think about an apples to apples picture of, is the basket of services that the state was providing, say prior to Proposition 13, is that roughly the same basket now? And it's kind of hard to tell because we've taken over a lot of responsibility for schools. We took away some of the fiscal relief that was provided after Proposition 13. We took responsibility at the state level for trial courts, but we've pushed back out to the locals' responsibility for realignment, something called realignment, which is primarily health, corrections, and some social services programs. So if somebody were to do that analysis, they would hopefully come up with a more refined answer. But my sense is we're probably talking about something in the neighborhood of 1% of total state personal income. $15 million, maybe it's a little more, maybe it's a little less. So that sets a context for me, which says the state needs more resources. Now, you have to set that in the context of what both David and John Elwood talked about, which is where does the state stand? And we're about a high, medium state. Some taxes are higher, personal income taxes relative to other states. Corporation taxes are higher relative to other states. Sales taxes are relatively pretty much in the middle. Property taxes are lowish middle. And motor vehicle taxes, which are not part of the general fund, are like 44th or 45th among the states, which helps to explain why our roads and highways are suffering. Voters appear to be willing to pay more taxes in order to avoid further cuts, especially if we're restoring cuts to education, and especially, as John Elwood said, if somebody else is paying the tax. Part of the backdrop here that all of the speakers have touched on is Proposition 13. It's changed the nature of the relationship between state and local government, and as a consequence, it's changed the way in which state revenues work at the state level in a fundamental way. So we've got limited capacity at the local level to raise revenues independently. There's a disconnect between responsibility for programs and being the one who's willing to take the political heat to actually raise the taxes. And we've got these kind of crazy allocation schemes because property taxes are actually allocated in California on the basis of a 3-year average for the 3 years prior to Proposition 13. So over 35 years ago, that's now what's driving the allocation of property taxes in California. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Recently, there's been some interest on the part of the legislature in looking at an issue with respect to hospital districts, for example, where some hospital districts have a bunch of money because they've got a historical share of property taxes, and they're kind of thinking, well, what should we spend this money on? That makes no sense. We ought to, at the local level and at the state level, be making choices with respect to how we spend the dollars and where should the dollars go to meet our highest priority needs. And those allocation mechanisms that we've got under Prop 13 kind of hobble us in terms of being able to do that. In addition, with respect to the sales tax, it's allocated on the basis of situs, namely where has the transaction actually occurred. That creates something called the fiscalization of land use, which means that local zoning and development decisions are made in part on the basis of decisions about can we grab the sales tax revenue from the big box stores? Can we grab the sales tax revenue from the auto malls? At the state level, the revenue structure has shifted over time, as we've talked about, to shift to much more heavy reliance on the personal income tax. during the 1960s, sales taxes represented about 0.5% of state personal income and roughly the same percent of total general fund revenues. That's now down to about 30%. And what's happened instead is the personal income tax has made up the slack. So super heavy dependence on the income tax. And along with it, the volatility that comes from the income tax. The volatility in income tax comes from the fact that upper bracket taxpayers have, as David pointed out, much more capacity to change and vary the timing of when they pay taxes. They can decide to take more deductions this year and push income off to next year. They can buy municipal bonds, which means there's no tax that comes to California. So as a consequence, that fluctuates. You overlay that with a relatively data poor understanding of capital gains receipts, and it means we're kind of flying blind, which translates in turn into the variance with respect to the estimates of taxes, of revenues that will actually be raised by virtue of particularly the governor's proposed tax increase. So those upper bracket increases will translate into some dollars, but is it going to be $6 billion this year, or is it going to be $9 billion? Well, we're not quite sure because, A, it's tough to have a crystal ball to say where the stock market's going to be on December 31st of 2012. If I had that crystal ball, I probably wouldn't be talking to you here today. But even if we have an estimate, we may not be able to translate that all that well. So from my perspective, a big piece of the challenge and a big piece of thinking about tax policy is how do we manage that volatility? You can manage it in one of two ways. You can manage it by changing the state's tax structure, or you can manage it by providing for better budget management of excess revenues. And I would argue that we probably ought to do both, because neither approach by themselves are going to be able to solve that volatility problem. We probably don't want to give up all of the growth potential associated with a highly progressive income tax because it just grows more over time than the sales tax or the property tax. But at the same time, so we might be willing to give up some of it and give up a little of that long-term revenue growth potential. But we're not going to want to give up a lot. And by the same token, on the rainy day fund side, or managing excess revenues, revenue spikes, we probably, for instance, if we had tried to put together a rainy day fund of, what, 15 billion, 20 billion, would that have been big enough? No, it wouldn't have been big enough. So from my perspective, it's really a combination of both. I think it's helpful to think about the tax proposals that are on the ballot in a short-term frame and a longer-term frame. If we think about a longer-term frame, then the issues that John Decker raised are really key, which is how do we want to reorganize the structure of state and local finance generally so that it makes more sense. In order to do that, we probably are going to have to come to grips with John ELLWOOD'S issue at some point in time, which is this structural imbalance between the ability to raise revenues with a majority vote, with a 2/3 vote, and the ability to spend those monies with a majority vote. That's fundamentally an untenable situation. At the same time, we need to look at the short term, the short run problem. The state needs the money. Programs are getting hammered. You look across state programs and there's almost none that have not been touched at all. So in that context then, what are the pluses and minuses associated with, for example, the governor's proposal? Well, it doesn't help us so much on the volatility front because it does rely on upper bracket income taxpayers That's mitigated slightly by a 1/4 cent increase in the sales tax, but that's not going to make a huge difference. So not so good on the volatility issue. How about in terms of tax policy? Well, tax policy is a combination of where we want to be with respect to competitiveness, where we want to be with respect to the efficiency of the tax, where we want to be with respect to whether or not the tax is equitable. From an equity perspective, and going back to John Elwood's point, we do pretty well. We've got a highly progressive income tax, although some would argue that as you move through the brackets at the state level, you get too quickly to the top bracket, and maybe that ought to be reworked. So if a family with taxable income of about $96,000 is paying the same 9.3% rate as a family that's making $900,000. And maybe that doesn't make as much sense from a tax policy perspective. Another consideration that we should bring into mind would be the question of whether or not the income tax is hurting us from a competitiveness perspective. Are people manipulating their income? Are they moving out of state? And the data, in fairness, is pretty sparse on that issue. Economists would tell us generally that the broader the base, the lower the rates. Generally, that's a good thing with respect to taxes. Obviously, looking then at progressivity in that context. Economists would probably also tell us that it's probably not helpful for states to try and right all of the wrongs with respect to income inequality. That perhaps in terms of income taxes, that's a policy handle or policy lever that should be used by the national government, because they're not going to be subject to, we don't put ourselves in a position where we are facing so much, at least in terms of the potential for interstate competition as it relates to rates. So from the perspective of these considerations, the governor's proposal is a bit of a mixed bag. I guess personally, I would argue we ought not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because at this point in time, I don't see something that will help to solve the problem that we face, the immediate problem that we face in terms of the budget gap. Longer term, we should be looking at reform. For the last year or so, I've been involved with a group called the Think Long Committee for California. And though today I'm speaking on my own and representing only my own views, I want to share just very briefly what they're thinking about. They're thinking of a longer term set of issues, which is maybe the immediate budget fix or a portion of the budget fix is now, and that's dealt with by the governor's proposal, although the committee itself has not endorsed the governor's proposal. Longer term, we ought to look at, should we tax services? Should we extend the sales tax to a broader basket of services? From an economic perspective, that probably makes sense. Broaden the base, lower the rate. We're letting a lot of economic activity in California get away from us as a consequence. And because fundamentally the committee was a political process, there was some give and take. And so the give in exchange for expanding the sales tax to services and deciding to raise $10 billion in new monies was to slightly flatten the personal income tax, to change it to a two-rate structure and drop the top rate from 9.3% to 7.5%. That makes the personal income tax less progressive. So the committee dealt with that issue by providing for a substantial, to the tune of $4.5 billion, rebate to low and moderate income taxpayers to offset the hit that they would take by virtue of the increase in the sales tax, which then keeps the package more progressive as a whole. It's not perfect, but the state gets a little bit in the way of bragging rights by virtue of maybe modifying the perception that California is just a bad tax state. And from my perspective, I think it moves in the right direction. A broader base of taxes, move where the money is in terms of sales taxes, and provide some additional, namely $10 billion in additional revenues long-term on an annual basis to the state. Ultimately, the issues that David talked about, though, are going to be the driver in terms of voters' willingness to approve higher taxes. The state's going to have to come to grips, and I don't know that there's an easy way to do this, come to grips with some of the political and programmatic dysfunction that we see. So otherwise, the voters are not going to be willing to tax themselves, which is fundamentally what the Think Long proposal asks them to do. It asks them to pay for sales taxes on haircuts and automobile repair and attorneys and accountants and so forth on down the list. And voters are not going to be willing to do that unless they see a more functional government and have more trust in it. With that, let's have some questions.
Excellent. So if I can ask the panel to come back up to the table, and I'm going to start with one question of my own, and then we'll go to the audience, and I'll ask the panel to respond kind of briefly. But it's a basic structural question, I guess, which is this: a lot of people talked about volatility. Most people, I think, agree that the system, although maybe David doesn't agree, but that the system is generally too volatile. Particularly, really, the problem is born when times are good and we have a lot of money and we don't manage it very well, as Tim said, and we get ourselves into long-term trouble by commitments. So if volatility is a problem, by the same token, Californians clearly want a progressive system. They want to tax the guy behind the tree who's the rich guy, not the bulk of them. Isn't there a fundamental tension there that you can't really, to the degree that you make the system more stable, you're likely to make it less progressive? If you want to make it, if you want to keep the progressivity, it's hard to do that and reduce the instability. Isn't that, does anybody want to touch on that sort of?
Sure. I think that's true. I think there's a fundamental trade-off there in some respects between at least some measure of progressivity. Some have suggested that one way to get at putting more or infusing more progressivity into the current state and local tax system would be to reform Proposition 13. Obviously, that's a significant challenge, but that would be a way of moving to a somewhat more stable revenue base, but not relying so heavily on the income tax.
Which is, and I'm sure the first thing Dave would say is that that's not very politically viable because voters are not going to let you change Prop 13.
Yeah, I think the answer is the tax structure, as I said, I think is pretty good. What you do need is some way of capturing that windfall when it comes in and setting it aside. Now, we've had proposals to reinvigorate the GAN limit, which was passed year after Prop 13, and that those proposals have been coming forward more recently. The Comptroller's Office, I believe, had another proposal way to identify windfalls and set them aside in a rainy day fund. So there's been a variety of proposals to try and capture that windfall that comes when the volatility is high and put it in to a reserve to use when it goes down. Therefore, you maintain the progressivity of the tax structure, but you deal with the volatility.
And can anybody really design a rainy day fund that cannot be rated? I mean, ultimately, isn't that the problem? If you have a lot of money in a rainy day fund, sooner or later, somebody's going to figure out, some clever person like you guys is going to tell the legislature and the governor how to rate it, right?
No, I disagree. I mean, I think you can do something like that, but the trade-off is that you'll have something that's relatively inflexible, because the way to do it is to put the provisions in the Constitution, but anything you write in the Constitution can't anticipate all of every future contingency, and so as a consequence, you're probably going to have some problems.
John, did you want to say something about that?
And Tim, when he was director of finance with that big windfall and the volatility, did a very good job of saying, let's put this into one-time things. And the challenge is being able to, if not hold it in reserve, put it into one-time and get enough of a support for that. So it's sort of, the problem is us. The problem is wanting to do that. And without that desire, it's hard to construct something that won't be creatively messed with.
I think the other thing you have to remember is the history of big surpluses in this state. Jerry Brown, one, lived with a huge surplus, which is one thing that gave impetus to the folks who went after Prop 13. Why? You got all this money out there from the individual income tax. You don't need high property taxes. So from a politician's point of view, if you can't design something with this massive, rainy day fund or any surplus, or people will say, why aren't you spending that money? Okay? I mean, what are you doing? And so you got a problem. It turns out at the national level, that's true as well in terms of Social Security. So it's an ongoing problem, okay, in terms of that.
Okay, questions. And I'm going to repeat the questions because we don't have a mic for questions, and we're videotaping this for a webcast. Yes, sir.
Perhaps all of you referred to the governor's proposal, which confuses me since he's supporting two different initiatives. His original proposal and the alleged compromise proposal with the millionaires tax key people. And one of you specified which one you meant.
I'm sorry.
I don't even know if you meant the same one.
Okay,
Please clarify that.
the question is the difference between the governor's original proposal and his compromise proposal. He reached a compromise with the California Federation of Teachers, and I think he's now supporting the second proposal. Somebody want to talk about that, and has actually stopped collecting signatures on the first.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to as the compromise proposal. I'm not sure whether the signature gathering has stopped as it related to the first, although it may well have. But I don't have much doubt that if the compromise proposal qualifies for the ballot, that's the one he would support.
Fred.
Yep. Dave, you might comment on the Prop 13, and I think the basic underlying law is that it would equalize and you wouldn't get any more revenue if you took it off. But my point is, the point I want to make is the millionaire's tax. I shared two major programs at Berkeley, mental health and public policy in 2002 and mental health and law in 2008. The mental health system is being systematically dismantled, and the Supreme Court just said you're going to take all these prisoners who are mentally ill and put them back in the camp. Darrell Steinberg put forth the Prop 63, the millionaire's tax, saying we're going to solve this. Jerry Brown told me that the vast majority of the homeless were severely mentally ill, which is a physically based disability of the brain and the mind and the functionality of the individual. And he said, if I could just get them to take their medication, I could save the city millions. All right, I read every one of those plans from counties, and better than 50% of that Prop 63 money has nothing to do with treatment, which is what we were promised. There's been no difference in terms of people on the street. How do you keep a tax proposal, which they say is going to accomplish something, how do you ensure that it's going to accomplish something? This one did not.
Okay, so to summarize that question, I'm going to slightly broaden it, which is he was referring to the Steinberg millionaires tax measure that was earmarked for mental health programs. How do you make sure that money is spent on mental health programs, and all broaden it to all ballot box budgeting measures? How do you, when the voters vote to commit tax stream X to purpose Y, how do you ensure that that actually happens?
I think it's a bad idea. Ballot box budgeting is results in programs getting money that they can't spend. We've seen the first five have huge surpluses that aren't being spent because their money is earmarked. There's too much ballot box budgeting, so I wouldn't want to go further.
Part of the why as to why ballot box budgeting is a bad idea is because if you have a guaranteed stream of revenue, then you don't have an incentive on the part of the people who are planning the program to spend it wisely, because if it's not spent wisely, it can't be taken away.
That's right.
Just let me be very academic here, okay? You have to cut a marginal dollar. you should be able to look at all programs to cut that marginal dollar. If I have a marginal dollar, I should look at all programs to do that. California has gone exactly the opposite way in a world where the world is always changing. And if he's talking about inefficiencies, that's one of the reasons we have inefficiencies. Now, you happen to be you love that program, that's fine, and therefore you want to lock it in. Well, but that's what that does. It's an earmarked tax. Otherwise, you should I'm just talking theory, and therefore no one takes academics seriously. But basically, you should raise revenues, okay, and it should sit there for what you want to spend the money on. And you should make an argument of that through the appropriations process, not through initiatives which are pushed through by, in many cases, emotion at the moment. You know, we know from Liz Gerber's work that only about a third of California initiatives work. And it's usually associated with some crisis of the moment. But the problem is, once you get it in, the only way to change it is another goddamn initiative. And you might not be lucky. It might not be that time when you have the scandal or whatever it is, or the horror story, to get the modification through. So, I mean, so if we're going to talk, this doesn't matter because Californians love their process, but I'm just sort of playing the game of a pure academic. And maybe I'd like John to speak to this as well, because no one mentioned Serrano around here, okay? One of the problems at the local level here is local governments, be it whatever, be it counties or locals, they make decisions on how much to spend. But they don't have to march back to their voters and say, by the way, I want you to raise your taxes in order to do this, okay? And that's basically because of the legislature's decision on how to deal with after Prop 13, I guess that's what it was. And that creates a huge disincentive or malincentive in that what you would want in the world is the same people who are going to give you all these good things, these programs, should be forced to raise the money to pay for them. And we don't have that at the local level in California.
John, or Dave, do you want to talk? And then John, do you want to talk about?
You go first. The problem is that those things are not unchangeable. The allocation system for the property tax. The cities and counties just got recently passed 2 initiatives saying the legislature, in effect, can't take any money away from us. So they makes it, I mean, everything goes back to this putting more and more in the Constitution. The same with the fundamental issue of supporting schools. Serrano, as you mentioned, made it in effect a state program because schools you have to fund schools uniformly from the property tax. So locals don't have the authority to go off on their own because then it would be a violation of Serrano.
Okay, my colleague Gene Bardak wrote a book once on what he called the regulatory ratchet. It was Kagan and Bardak, around 2 guys from around here. So you have a regulation, and it doesn't work very well. Rather than getting rid of the regulation, you get another regulation, and that one doesn't work, and then you get another regulation. We're doing the exact same thing with tax and spending policy. And you know why? Because these decisions are made incrementally at the margin, and so you never go back and simply say, let's do it right. Instead, what you do is you get a fix, and each fix makes it worse. That's my view, anyway.
John, do you want to say anything about that?
And there's a tension. You know, on the one hand, we want universal service levels, but then we want local control. And it's that tension that sort of pushes a little one way and a little other and makes it very difficult to guarantee local control and live with the consequences.
Other questions? And the California politics student should remember Professor Lempert is standing at the back keeping track of who's going to ask questions. So the young man back there at the back.
Yes, several of the speakers touched on the fact that the 2/3 rule should be lowered to a simple majority to raise revenues. Obviously, that's challenging to do through the legislature or through the public via the ballot. Could a constitutional convention present a viable method?
Okay, so the question is, if you can't get rid of the 2/3 requirement for revenues if the voters won't do it, you'd have to take it to the voters because it's in Prop 13. Could a constitutional convention do that? Or I'll ask it and say, is a constitutional convention a good idea to achieve governance reform? Anybody want to? Well, that's true. You still have to go to the voters. Go ahead.
Exactly. The voters would still have to approve it. So that would be the ultimate hurdle. A couple of years ago, there was a group, actually centered in the Bay Area, that was exploring the possibility of a constitutional convention. And one of the concerns, they didn't get there, one of the concerns that was raised was, were there any restraints in terms of what issues they might get into? And that caused some people concern and was one of the reasons why things didn't move forward. But ultimately, you'd still have to persuade the voters.
Remember the Constitutional Convention that led to the U.S. Constitution? Its original mandate was to propose a few amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Mm-hmm. And they got together and they went wild. Now, you venerate what they did, maybe, but they didn't follow their mandate. And so a lot of people are very scared of what would happen out there.
Other question. Are you in California politics? Oh, all right. I was going to try to get extra credit for somebody. I'm trying hard here. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious. I'm interested in your statement that we spend money with the majority and need a supermajority for the budget. Did anybody ever propose requiring a supermajority to spend it as well?
The question is, has anybody proposed a supermajority to spend money and go ahead and answer. I think the answer is we basically had one until
that was the first big property tax reform called the Riley-Stewart Act of 1933, where the voters approved a program that said you can't spend more than 5% than you spent in the prior year without a two-thirds vote. Well, since they started to do that, every year they spent more than 5%, so they had always a two-thirds vote, so the voters changed it in 1964 to require a two-thirds vote. So it was two-thirds vote until last election, when under the guise of penalizing the legislature for not passing budget on time, which was the commercial that you saw on television, under the table they changed that two-thirds to a majority. And from that, you don't have the give and take that produces a consensus budget. I saw consensus budgets from 1959 through about 1986 that went through the process. Each house adopted its own budget by a two-thirds vote. And you didn't have these constant battles because the idea was everybody works together to try and produce something that everybody likes. And then when everybody produces a budget, then if it needs revenue, at that time the revenues were there. But when it becomes so polarized, then you don't have that.
But David, isn't that the key difference? The revenues were there and they're not there now, and if it's easier to get two-thirds when the revenues are there.
No, I think the tax increases you had under Governor Reagan were probably the largest in state history. Then after that, Pete Wilson's taxes probably ranked second. But through that whole process, the Reagan tax increases got a bipartisan vote. So did the ones suggested by Governor Deukmejian. And you had both sides working together because they were working together on the budget. Now nobody works together on the budget. Put it out the last day of the session or the last day before the budget is due and vote it up or down.
Can I give a different view here? I don't think polarization is, the rise in polarization is caused by a particular California institution. Look at the United States Congress, okay? It turns out that Boris Shore, who's a postdoc around here and teaches at the University of Chicago, is developing data to look at polarization in each state legislature. Guess which state has the highest level of polarization in the United States? You're sitting in it, okay? And the folks who study that have a series of theories as to why that's the case, some of which don't apply to California. One is called sorting, where at the national level you used to have conservatives in the Democratic Party located in the South. They're still in the South. They're called Republicans now. You had liberals in the North. They're still liberals. They're called Democrats now. So ideology has become more important. And some people would say that's happened in California east-west, where it used to be north-south, that you've had sorting. But the other thing, and it's just a very impressive graph, is polarization going all the way back to 1790 increases as the percentage of foreign-born goes up and declines as the percentage of foreign-born goes down. because one party becomes the nativist party and the other party becomes the party of the immigrant group. California used to be essentially an all Anglo-white state, folks. It ain't anymore. And you can just put the percentage of foreign-born on California and then look at the rise in polarization in the state legislature, and they just track one another. Now, there's another thing that I don't totally believe, although it's also very impressive, is the rise of income inequality. When that happens, and you assume that parties go where the median voter is, and as income inequality changes, there's a difference between the mean and the median voter out there. But those are things that are happening everywhere. And Boris has data saying polarization's happening everywhere. Places that don't have the California tax system and don't have the particular institutions we have in California. So the question is, are our institutions calling this in the polarization, or is the polarization causing our problems in terms of policy? I think I would come down mostly with the second point, the second view.
One or two more questions. Yes.
Okay, so going back to the idea of kind of reforming the budget, better plan long-term for California going forward, bringing back kind of the 2/3 requirement for both raising revenues and spending, or bringing the 2/3 limit for raising revenues down to a simple majority?
Do you want a big government or a small government?
The question was, would it be better to eliminate the 2/3 requirement for taxes, or re-implement the 2/3 requirement for the state budget? I think the answer is going to be it depends on which one of the panelists you ask.
No, I think your question was the right one.
Do you want a big state or a small state?
I think California is running too lean for the size of the state that we have. I think that the government right now is too lean to provide the necessary services to the people of California.
But we don't pay for the services we have now. We're, for 15 years, 10 years, we've been rolling over a structural deficit. I mean, my favorite out there is, the California balanced budget requirement is simply that you pass one that the governor signs. And a millisecond after that happens, it's out of balance, okay? Here's a quasi-liberal state. Wisconsin used to be a very liberal state, now no longer. They have to balance their budget at the end of the fiscal year. If that's so go what you really want to do, okay? I have values. My values say you have all this human capital out there in the form of mostly folks from Mexico and Latin America. You want to invest in those folks so that they get good jobs and do things. That's a liberal view, okay? That takes money, okay? If you 2/3, I'm not going to get that money. So I will have a small state. There are small states. Look at Texas.
One last question. Yes, back there, that young man.
Are we going to see an increase in intervention via court mandates in the future? The most recent example being prison realignment. Do you foresee that occurring more frequently in the future as a fiscal intervention?
The question is, are the courts going to take over more and more of the state budget as they effectively have with corrections?
I think the example of corrections is a somewhat unique case. That having been said, I think the answer to your question is yes, we're likely to see more court intervention, not because we haven't seen a lot of it in the past, but as you try and cut programs in tough budget times, the courts are in effect the bulwark against some of those reductions. You look at reductions in the Medi-Cal program, the in-home supportive services program, and so forth. And primarily by virtue of the operation of the courts defending federal law, they have stepped in. I haven't studied this, but I would guess somewhat more frequently.
Let's let Jack had his hand up.
Oh,
I want to hear that.
Yeah, we should give Jack the last question then.
Has a tax in the issue, it's a simple majority, which is the reason why that's the route that has been taken, given that John Michael puts out the possibility of getting a simple majority. But, the undertone of some of these remarks is, New Yorkers are smart, Californians are dumb. Why do they want it? democracy stuff, why do they pass all of these things? So, you know, here's my question, are the voters dumb? Are they wrong not to just say, hey, take away all of this, you know, direct democracy and let's trust the legislature to do the right thing? You know, my own sense is the level of mistrust of the legislature is in some sense part of the political culture that sustains this horrible, you rightly point out, the dilemma of ballot box budgeting. But ballot box budgeting comes about, I think, because these separate interest groups see this as the only way that they can get what they want.
To summarize that question, if I can, are the voters is the voters' affection for direct democracy misplaced, or in fact do the voters like direct democracy as a rational response to the dysfunction of the system? Is that a fairly good summary?
That's a better question than I asked.
Who wants to?
It's a tough question to answer globally, but I think you've put your finger on something. I think that voters, and it would be interesting to look at, I think this is the case, the number of measures that have gone to the ballot, whether they've succeeded or not, since Proposition 13, as compared to before, that related to kind of taking over tax and spending decisions. Because part of my argument would be that Proposition 13, because it centralized power at the state level, plus the two-thirds vote requirements on both sides, less and less happened that was functional at the state level. And so as a consequence, and it's not just the voters, in fairness, it's various interests of various stripes that have gone to the ballot box in order to get what they want because they aren't able to get it through the legislative process.
I would say that Proposition 13 was the only grassroots tax measure that's passed. That everyone that's passed after that has been the brainstorm of an interest group coalition trying to get a share of the budget guaranteed, whether it's the schools or the health, you know, people, you know, now again, this Munger thing is an example of that.
I mean,
You know, what's happened in a way is that the initiative process has, in some sense, become a version of what the legislative process used to be, where you get these different groups. You know, if you want to build a bunch of roads, you got to get the environmentalists on board. So, you know, you have to throw some crumbs in that direction, and you know, each one of these things. You know, Prop 13, at least my interpretation of it, was, and John alluded to this, there's all of this money sitting around, although no one was exactly sure how much this fund was. Taxes were going up and up and up. Legislature promised to deal with it. Legislature didn't deal with it. Whoosh, you get signatures collected in about one day. But since then, it's become a whole different kind of process.
And it created more in the nature of a zero-sum game in terms of budget resources.
Prop 13 was not a ballot box budgeting measure. It just controlled the property tax. After that, you saw the various budget measures that voters weren't given a full menu. They just had to vote on whether we want to do SEMSTEL research or spend money on First Five or Arnold's after school initiative. So we're cutting education budget, but that's money for after school is still there, and it's separated by that initiative. You have a whole series of those that came later. But Prop 13 was grassroots, and I think Prop 13 has worked very well.
And
Opinion on this initiative process is kind of curious because field polls have done many such polls, and when people see the problems, you know, with these initiatives, they say, should we want this reform, should we want this reform? You might get majorities in favor of little tweaks, and the bottom line says, would you give it up, or do you trust policies through the initiative, passed through the initiative, or through the legislature, the initiative always wins. Sort of like a bad marriage where you don't get.
You know, I could never get PPIC to do what should be done in this area. You got to stop, Jack, because you're going to do it. And that is, since Jack is an expert on Prop 13, but he's also an expert on alienation measures. You would expect variance in the degree of alienation towards state government being associated with the institutions at the state level, controlling for other things. But we don't have that data or those data. But that's what you'd like to do. Because otherwise, when Nelson Polsby was still alive, he would look at me and say, Elwood, you assume this is different. It's no different. It's just messier. And therefore, you don't like it as an academic, that sort of thing. On the other hand, I really do think we're in the political equivalent of a liquidity trap. We've sort of got ourselves caught down there and we don't know how to get out of it. That's my personal, and I put greater stress not on passing initiatives, but that once you pass it, how difficult it is to modify if it doesn't work out once it's sort of going along there. That's my personal view.
Okay, that door is gonna open. There's some food in there and so forth. Hope you'll all come in and join us, and my thanks to the panel.